French President Emmanuel Macron has ruled out giving up on pension reform plans despite 2 weeks of massive public transport strikes. Macron's office has, however, noted the president is willing to improve the plan regarding the age qualification for a full pension. Government claims the new system will be fair and more transparent and will improve pensions for women and low earners in particular. The government and labor unions are set to hold yet another round of negotiations over the planned pension overhaul. Earlier, union leaders vowed to continue their strikes until the new year, till the plan is withdrawn. Weeks of transport stoppage ahead of the Christmas holidays had disrupted daily commuting, and hardliner CGT union claims cutting electricity to tens of thousands of homes in several cities. Now joining us for this news review is Mr. Rodney Shakespeare, author and commentator from London, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I want to welcome you both to the program. Rodney Shakespeare, we're going to start with you, Professor. Your thoughts on what we're seeing today with respect to the protests and also Emmanuel Macron's reaction to them?
This today represents a deepening of the crisis. You see, for 1 year, there were the yellow vest protesters. Now, those people, yellow vest, were the gig economy, insecure jobs, part-time jobs, and they were hit badly by the fuel rise. But they didn't then have support or any alliance with the unions. Now, what you've got now is you've got the unions coming in for their own purposes, but at the same time joining in protest. And that really only leaves one third group, which as yet has not joined, which is the permanently unemployed in the great housing estates on the outskirts of Paris. But this represents a deepening of the economic crisis in France. It represents unease of people who feel that in a world where there is plenty of technological, physical capacity to create wealth, all the time the rich-poor division gets greater and they get pushed into insecurity, etc.
And now, Tony, we spoke yesterday about this, and it seems like Macron initially said, both him and Edouard Philippe said, well, we'll give no concessions. We have no room to budge on this. You already see Macron slightly budging. Do you think with more of these strikes, we'll see more out of Macron, or do you see this thing getting dragged out?
Well, I mean, you have to say that Macron is being incredibly reckless here. The idea of politicians, top politicians, a president, is to negotiate, but he seems to be pushing as hard as he can in a negotiating position, which is almost untenable, basically stealing 2 years of pensions from all of the public servants in France. And this is, obviously a provocation. But he just sees this as a bit of deal-making, game-playing, and he's playing with the lives of millions, tens of millions of French people. Obviously, that is not a way a president should behave. It's a form of despotism. The French people are starting to see Macron now as the lord of chaos. They didn't really want him in the first place. He was a massively funded campaign for him to come in on the back of the demonisation, to a certain extent, of Marine Le Pen and the nationalists in France. To be honest, they were allowing far too much infiltration of their party by the far right, which helped Macron get in the first place. But, this is just another protest that we've seen all over the world. We're seeing, it seems, an increasing number of large protests going on. But they're divided really into the good protests and the bad protests. The good protests get maximum coverage on the mainstream press here in the West. This is where the NATO countries and the West wants regime change of some sort. Those are the good protesters. In Hong Kong, of course, that's one where they want as much problem and trouble as possible for the Chinese. In two, where they want regime change. In Venezuela, where they want some kind of they have some sort of problems over there too. But then we've got the bad protesters, the nasty, the wicked protesters. Those protests are against puppet-controlled governments by the West. They get very little coverage, and they're branded as terrorists a lot of the time. And this is where I'm afraid the French protests fit into. Very little coverage, similar to what's been going on in Palestine, in Bolivia, And this is where the mainstream press has really fallen down. And even though France is so close by, very little coverage, certainly no real analysis here in the UK, despite Macron being increasingly isolated over the last few days. I see that the former finance minister, Michel, has said that Macron has to change his attitude. So the people you would be expecting to support the government are falling like flies. Macron is ending up virtually on his own, especially after the resignation of the pensions minister. I mean, what is the only ally really Macron had left, and he's gone. So Macron is on his own, fighting the whole of the French people. It's not surprising the French are calling him a despot.
And Mr. Professor Shakespeare, you heard Tony allude to how Macron kind of came into office, and another thing, as part of his platform, was to shore up, over a decade of austerity in the country, not to lay into it and kick into a higher gear. What do you think happened?
Well, they do not have a solution to the underlying problem in conventional economics and politics. That's what it's really all about. They come in putting in or increasing all the strategies and policies of an outdated, inefficient paradigm and understanding of reality. They're not able to think anew. And as a result, as Tony's indicating, you're getting protests right the way around the world. And although some of them are essentially political, most of them have this element of recognition that in a world of massive capacity to solve all your physical problems, you've got half the world living on under $3 a day. And in the countries like in France, they know there's no reason why there should be these increased rich-poor division. And that's the result of the trickle-down theory, which says if you have great up here rich people, it trickles down. It doesn't trickle down because the rich cannot and do not spend all their wealth. They never will, and they are unable to actually spend it. So you see, it's outdated thinking. They have no solution to it, and this sort of thing will go on. And in the case of France, you can expect these events to deepen and probably become much more serious.
And your final thoughts on that, Tony?
Well, I mean, I think that the solutions are out there. It's just that they're looking the other way. The French government don't want to know what the solutions are. Many radical economists, people like Steve Keen, the author of Debunking Economics, they have been talking for many years now about something called the people's quantitative easing, which is where the banks making up money as they're doing now. The Eurozone is making up billions and billions all the time to try and prop up share prices and asset prices. That money is simply given to the government and put into these French pensions. No problem at all. Very easy to do. But remember, economics is a bit of a dark art, as I'm sure Rodney knows. He's an expert in the subject. And you can kind of try and make it seem like it's just running a normal household bank account. It's not at all. In fact, they could make up all this money, sort this problem out tomorrow if they really want to, but there's not the political will. They want to beat the French people down, and I think Macron is going to pay the price if he carries on like this, because remember, back in the 1790s, we had the French Revolution. I mean, remember, French people can't go to work at the moment. That's how bad things are there. Many of them just simply can't make it. Louis XVI, he ended up with his head on the chopping block. Hopefully it won't be quite so murderous, Macron, but he may well have to go by one means or another. The French are very, very conscious of their history. When they don't believe, they don't trust their rulers, they get out on the streets and they get rid of them.
And Professor Shakespeare, do you have any final thoughts you want to get in?
Well, yeah, there are. Tony is right. There are solutions, but believe you me, Macron doesn't know what they are. The ultimately lies in matters to do with the financial system, about which you are told lies. There is a solution, but the French don't want to know, because you see, the existing system represents the interests of a very narrow elite who control all the thinking in the universities and in the politics. Yes, but Tony is broadly right, yes.
And guess what? Emmanuel Macron is from that 0.1%, so that's probably obviously why we're at this fork in the road. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us. Rodney Shakespeare out of London and Tony Gosling there joining us out of Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye for now.